Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10. How are you today? Good. Let's hope it stays that way. I shall do my best to perpetuate the general sense of well-being and happiness with which you're currently surrounded. And actually, this happens sometimes in the mornings. Does it happen to you? Well, I don't suppose it does, actually, because you don't do this for a living. I sort of found myself resisting the urge to reach immediately for the usual levers this morning. I failed to resist that urge in the little talk-up just before the news. I do think that it is not a coincidence, shall we say, that as immigration falls off the front pages, except for the relatively small number of people in the great scheme of things, net migration, that's people coming here in full accordance with the law, is up to 700,000. So people coming here to seek asylum or safety in total is a relatively small part of the picture. And of course, the people coming over the English Channel in dinghies are an even smaller relatively speaking, part of the picture. But apart from the people in the dinghies, government not really talking about it, right-wing media not really talking about it, despite spending years telling you that you had to leave the European Union in order to bring these numbers down. And at the same time, they have really ramped up, it seems to me, the focus on disabled people and sick people, people with mobility or mental health problems, long-term sick. And I don't think it's a coincidence, but I just caught myself then as we came off the back of the news. And I don't know why, today of all days, I just caught myself thinking, well, look, maybe they've got a point. Maybe you're being a bit knee-jerk. Maybe you're being a bit lazy, James. Maybe you're indulging in what you always accuse others of, i.e. footballification. And because the Tories are doing it, you think it must be either cruel or callous or dishonest. They're painting targets on somebody's back and encouraging the rest of us to get cross with them, is how I often see things. And do you know why I often see things like that? Because that is often what they're doing. And that, I think, is why I reach immediately for comparisons with the immigration debate. Yeah, the most abiding words about immigration conversations that we've had on this programme over the years is always the, I didn't mean you, I don't mean you. It's a sort of evolution, if you like, of the some of my best friends are black defence that people being racist often offer up to prove that they're not racist, even as they are being racist. Oh, I didn't mean you. I was really taken by surprise by that. In the aftermath of the Brexit vote, when people were ringing up to tell me that their family members, their mother-in-law, had voted to leave because there were too many immigrants, to which the daughter-in-law would respond by saying, I'm Polish, Mum. And mother-in-law would say, oh, no, I didn't mean you. Those conversations are always, oh, I didn't mean you. But the target has nonetheless been painted on the back of people, even if they were not the people that you intended the target to be painted on the back of. And I see the target moving. But, look, Rishi Sunak has described some 2 million people who he believes could be working if only they were a bit more committed to finding work, if only they were trying a little bit harder to find work. And everybody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who has conclusive proof of fraud and lead swinging. I mean, people claiming a pittance in welfare payments as a fraud. That's the problem we're talking about today. Not the people who made millions and millions and millions of pounds perpetuating fraud during the COVID crisis by either supplying dodgy PPE or taking out loans that were never intended for the purpose described. All that kind of fraud. Rishi Sunak, of course, has already made clear he's not going to bother investigating any of that. So, don't go thinking that millions and millions and millions of pounds of fraud is somehow less important or more important. The important stuff is people claiming welfare payments on the sly, not the people making millions of pounds from defrauding the actual government or the NHS, okay? Just so we can be clear on that. I've done it already. I've reached for one of the usual levers. Honestly, the best laid plans of mice and men gang afterglay. I tried so hard, but it's Rishi Sunak, and as soon as you start talking about him, you sort of remember all the stuff that he's done. So clinging to the notion that this policy might be built in good faith. That's what I'm trying to do today. I don't want you to get cross with me because you can explain to me why you're certain that it's not in good faith. But I want to begin the phone-in, if I can, from a slightly different place to where we normally begin phone-ins like this. I want to begin it from the possibility that 2.4 million people claiming incapacity benefits could somehow, a significant proportion of them, could somehow be working from home. Now, that will mean, A, that they are capable of doing so, and B, that the work exists, and C, that somehow currently those two preconditions, the capability and the existence of work, are not being properly met or married. So that's where I want to come at it from. Do you think this is a genuine policy based on what you know? And it can be what you know about the system, or it can be what you know about the Tories. £4,680 a year to be removed from people who I think are already struggling to survive in many cases. And the threat of removing £4,680 a year from people on incapacity benefits, plural, is somehow designed to make the people who are capable of working in jobs that currently exist move into a space where they actually do the work that they're currently choosing not to work. And again, maybe I've picked the wrong topic to try and be a little bit more open-minded, if that's the right word, because again, this notion of choosing not to work when you could seems to me to be a deeply unfair characterization of 2.4 million people. Let's say even if it applied to 10% of that total, that's 240,000 people. But the story today, front page of the Times again, that's twice in a week or twice in a fortnight that the front page of the Times has been dedicated to describing Rishi Sunak's determination to clamp down on poorly people. I can't do it, can I? I can't keep an eye. I mean, just even the language is obnoxious. A crackdown on poorly people. How do you even... working from home push to get more sick Britons off benefits. They're not even claiming that they're not sick. There's not even a claim here that people are malingering or faking their illnesses. They're simply saying that there are jobs that sick people could do at home. And for some reason, they're not currently doing them. And the reason that Rishi Sunak has come up with is because you're too feckless or lazy or work shy. And therefore, in order to focus your mind upon the necessity of doing the job that currently exists and that you're definitely capable of doing but are currently choosing not to do, they're going to take a significant chunk of your living allowance away from you. No, I'm going to hang on to the idea that it might actually be a real thing. It might be true. Perhaps the figure is more than 240,000. Maybe there's 1 million people in this country perfectly capable of doing jobs in their homes. And maybe there are 1 million jobs currently available and vacant in this country that people are perfectly capable of doing in their homes. And all it takes is a threat to those 1 million people to take away the pittance that they currently live on, and suddenly they'll discover the desire and the ability to do the job that they're currently choosing not to do. Look, all right, I've tried. It's 11:11. It's 10. I'll tell you the time in a minute. It's 11 minutes after 10. I've tried to set it up in a way that allows the possibility that this is a genuine attempt to solve a genuine problem. I saw a homeless woman this morning without any shoes and socks coming up the stairs at Leicester Square tube station. She had no shoes and socks. She had scabs on her feet. And I struggle to think that the top priority for a government should be people who are currently at home because they're too sick to work outside the home. You're looking for a problem-solving government, a government that looks at the country and sees problems that it thinks it can solve. And Rishi Sunak is looking at people on sickness benefit who aren't currently working. And I struggle to see that as a problem. I don't know whether I'm being naive or stupid or fair. I struggle to look at the state of the United Kingdom and think, do you know what we really need to do? We need to clamp down on people who have been judged by a cruel system to be sick, to be in need of incapacity benefits. This is not about people faking or malingering. This is about people in genuine distress. This is about people with genuine mobility or mental health problems. People are judged by a vicious and cold-hearted system to be in need of incapacity benefits are pretty near the top of Rishi Sunak's to-do list when it comes to problems that he thinks he needs to solve. And his solution is to be crueler to you. His solution is to make your existence worse. That's completely failed. How long did that take? 6 minutes? That's completely failed. This is me. I'm sorry. This is me. This is sincere. This is authentic. This is disgusting. By all means, call me and persuade me that it's a genuine problem and this is a good solution to it. 0345 6060 973. But I can't do it. You're going to have your work cut out because I can't see it. The more I talk, the uglier it looks. People are judged by a cold-hearted system. 2.4 million people, judged to deserve incapacity benefits, are going to have their existence rendered worse than it is already if they don't prove to Rishi Sunak that they are looking for a job that may or may not exist. The presumption of laziness is offensive. The presumption of fraudulence is offensive. The idea that 2.4 million people are choosing to spend their lives on their sofas and reveling in their sickness, in their mobility issues, in their mental health problems, and high-fiving each other in the mirror every morning because they don't have to schlep into work like the rest of us do. I don't buy it. Okay, I'm not saying there's none. Of course there is. They've probably got undiagnosed mental health problems if you're choosing to live your life on your sofa. But I don't buy it. Unless you can persuade me otherwise. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 10:15 is the time. Is this a genuine policy designed to solve a genuine problem? And remember, they're not talking about the small number of people who may be misbehaving. They're talking about 2.4 million people currently claiming incapacity benefits. They're talking about all of us, all of you, all of them, all of them. Not the tiny number that your Auntie Doris reads about on Facebook or the window cleaner who's also claiming incapacity benefit for a bad back that he clearly hasn't got. They're not talking about them. They're talking about the bona fide recipients of an incapacity benefit. And they're saying we need to make their life worse if they don't get a job. And those two presumptions there, that they are capable of doing a job and that the job exists. And it's the same people who spent most of the last 3 years claiming that everybody working from home was a feckless work shy layabout. And now they're saying that there are lots more feckless work shy layabouts who should be working from. They don't even know what day it is, do they? They do not know whether they are coming or going. What does J-Dog think about this one? Do we know? Does he think it's a good idea to make poorly people work from home? Or is this yet more proof that working from home is the scourge of the modern age? Sheesh. 19 minutes after 10 is the time. Darren is in St Anne's-on-Sea. Where's that? I don't know, St Anne's-on-Sea. The sickest people in the country are working, James. They're working really, really hard for us. They're called the Conservative Party. I'll read this out, Josh, because you've phrased it quite politely, so it's not a contender for Idiot's Corner, but I think you'll realise as you hear your words back that you may have slightly misfired this morning. James, although I mostly agree with you, you dig into this corner whenever this type of conversation arises. What you fail to address is that, yes, although the vast majority will not be false claimants, there is a very large number of people who do abuse the system. But you never offer up a solution of how these people can get weeded out. No, you're right, because we're not talking about them. We're talking about 2.4 million people currently claiming incapacity benefits, a benefit which, in order to receive, you have to jump through some very dehumanising hoops. And the reason why I don't focus on the tiny number of people who may be swinging the lead is because everybody else does, Josh. It's like one of the most lazy tropes of phone-in radio. You know, the people who talk about flat-screen televisions, that everybody else does, mate. People tune into this programme to hear the truth, not to hear lazy targeting of often non-existent people, you know, whether they're immigrants or disabled people or parts of the population choosing to live on tuppence halfpenny a week. Come on, mate. You can do better than that, Josh. Sarah's in Liverpool. Sarah, what do you think?
Morning, James.
Morning, Sarah.
This is a genuine Tory policy.
Yeah, but is it a solution to a genuine problem?
No, it's not a solution to a genuine problem. It's a problem that they've just pulled out of thin air because they're desperate to win the next election.
How do you know? How do you know that there isn't a significant number of people who have those two prerequisites in place? They're capable of doing a job from home, and the job that they can do from home definitely exists.
Simple. Because, for a start, the vast majority of disabled, but people who are sick and disabled, cannot afford broadband.
Right.
I know that because I'm plugged into the networks. I'm not on the internet or anything, but I do know from various people, from various activist friends I've seen the reports, so I do know that. Yeah. Also, the amount of people who as some of your listeners think the vast majority of us swing the lead.
Yeah.
I hate to tell them, but what it is, it's 0.03%. So what happened to that 99.97%, the rest of us?
Where did you get that figure from? Do you mind?
I think it was from it's the ONS.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, not sure. But anyway, it's before COVID anyway.
But benefit fraud is historically massively smaller in reality than people think it is. And in fact, Josh in Cardiff makes the point for us, thinking it's a significant problem when it really isn't, except perhaps in the minds of the kind of people that this policy is designed to address. Even though this policy doesn't really talk about fraud, that's very much a side order. It talks about 2.4 million people who nobody is disputing need their incapacity benefit, but should lose a significant chunk of it if they can't prove to Rishi Sunak that they're looking for a job. That definitely exists.
But this is the bit that gets my goat.
Go on.
He says that people who are on incapacity benefit or ESA, whichever one they want to pick on this week, they want to dehumanise them and demonise them. That's quite simple. They've always been doing it. Whichever vulnerable group they want to pick on for each week, it's always sick and disabled, then it's the immigrants, then it's whoever, the OAPs or whoever else. The poor in general, whichever branch you want to pick on. They always do it every week without fail. And to be perfectly honest, I know what it's like to go through the hoops. I'll be the first to admit, I have got a neurological condition caused by Lyme disease. It also affects my heart and it affects my joints and muscles. And if I'm in front of a computer, if he thinks he says, "Oh yes, well they can go do work from home."
Yeah.
If you've got what I've got, which is chronic Lyme disease, and you have seizures when you look at a screen for more than half an hour, especially a computer screen.
Yes.
You can't even afford a computer, James.
Well, that's a point I hadn't thought of.
People can't afford it.
So you need the
all
hardware.
your money on blaming, yeah.
And you need what, 20 quid a month or thereabouts at least for a broadband deal, for a functioning broadband deal, and then you need somehow a commitment to an employer that you'll be able to do X number of. For most employers are going to need some sort of commitment, and many conditions will make that impossible. So the evidence that this isn't a real problem or a very big problem is mounting, but it's not non-existent. There must be some people on incapacity. And it's framed wrong as well. If it was being framed as we're going to help you find something that you can do, because we know how awful it must be, how soul-destroying it must be to be stuck in the house all day or not feel like you're not making good use of your time in your day. We're going to help you find something that you can do. We're going to find employers who will meet you halfway and you will be of benefit to each other. But it doesn't sound like that. The minute they're threatening to take your benefits away.
I can tell you straight, James. Years ago, now, before this shower, and Esther McVeigh in particular got in, when she was Disabilities Minister, back when this shower first got in.
Right.
There was do you remember Remploy?
Yes, I do remember Remploy, yes.
Yeah. Well, Remploy used to be there for anybody who they were trying to get a job. And you go, if you were able, you went to Remploy, and Remploy would find you a position in one of their places. Now, this shower decided to close Remploy.
Well, it still exists in some.
It doesn't.
Does it not? I thought it did.
No, it closed it.
Okay.
And the other thing is, they said, "Oh yes, well, real employers can deal with it." Now, I know what it's like when you're sick and disabled, and you try and get back to your old job. Now, I'm
going to have to crack on, Sarah, because I sense you're like me. If I don't interrupt you, you'll be talking until Sheila gets here.
They just don't want to know. They want people who fit and able, not somebody who
that's the point.
If anyone wants a book...
No, yes, exactly that. So employers, that's someone we often miss out of this conversation. Is there a queue of employers desperate for staff who are thinking, well, this could be perfect for me? There are people who are too sick to come to work, but they can work from home, and I've got just the kind of work they need to do, and I will pay for their computer and their broadband. This is a genuine question, which you presume Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have answered already. They must know that there is a queue of potential employers waiting to take up the reins that Sarah has just described. I don't buy it. Stephen's in Blackpool. Stephen, what would you like to say?
First time caller, long time listener.
Take your time.
I used to work for a company back in 2010 under the previous government, under a scheme called New Deal for Disabled People.
Yes, I remember that.
And it was my first. I used to work in retail. It was the first sort of big boy job that I had, and we worked with a great team. We had two guys that would go out to the employers. They would speak to the employers, explain what the program was all about, and I had a caseload of people who wanted to go back into work that were disabled and desperately wanted to work. We had incentives, and we got to know the people. And I think what this government are currently doing is not addressing the problem behind it. They've not got the support in the community. They've not got the support from an agency who can help them. They're just saying, get off benefits. And it's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, you remind us that other governments have had a sort of welfare to work policy, trying to get people into the workplace, and the New Deal was part of that. What happened to it?
And as soon as the Conservatives came in, I got made redundant.
It really is that simple? The system that existed in order to do what they claim they want to do was in place, and they axed it?
Yeah, and they gave it to their own private providers. Sector, yeah. So the provider I was working for, they had the contract pulled from them. Because we had a system where if a person registered with us, we got to know them, we helped them with what they were struggling with. Sometimes it was interview skills, sometimes it was technology, because everything had moved online at that point. And then, I had one chap, a lovely fella, fallen out of work because his wife had passed away, fallen into alcoholism, had ended up on incapacity benefits.
Right.
He desperately wanted to work but was struggling. We found him a really good position that worked for him at one of the local Asdas.
So this was slightly different in that you weren't finding work for people to do from home, but you were getting them back into the workplace. How, just sort of, and I appreciate you don't have the data to do this, but just in your view, how many people do you think there are stuck at home through sickness that could be married to an existing job that they could do from home?
I think,
is it a problem you're aware of? Did you come across people in this position?
Yeah, we did. We had a lady who she was stuck at home, but she wanted to do like a Tupperware company, and all she wanted was a trolley so she could go around to the local estate and take Tupperware, but do all the ordering and receiving from home. So again, part of the contract was if that person was successful in securing a job, be it self-employed, and we had a person within the office who would go through a business plan, check its viability, submit it, do all that for the claimant. That if they then secured a position, we would give them. But again,
she's not. I mean, someone with mobility issues isn't going to be able to push a trolley around the streets. But I hear you, Stephen. 10:30 is the time. There are jobs that you could do from home, especially if the company provided you with a computer and broadband. I just don't. When I read some of the coverage, I don't hear that message. I hear, find yourself a job or lose £4,680 a year. And that makes me think that the message is the medium. It's a performative whip crack. It's a performative stick where perhaps there is a case for carrots. 10:34 is the time. The journalist called Francis Ryan, who writes a column in The Guardian and has done a book called Crippled, Austerity and the Demonisation of Disabled People, is someone to whom I really would refer you if you're interested in the reality of the kind of people that the newspapers are talking about today, the kind of people that Rishi Sunak thinks need a bit of tough love, should we call it, in order to get off their backsides and do a day's work. So there's an acknowledgement in this so-called policy that they're too sick to leave home on a regular basis, but capable of working from home. Now, there will be some jobs. I've heard, I can't check stuff. I certainly can't reference stuff on air without seeing official documentation, but I've heard from a fella in the West Midlands who works for an insurance company and tells me that they do provide computers and even desks and broadband connections for people who would be able to do that job from home, sort of providing quotes and policies. So the jobs do exist, but of course, even then you might be competing against somebody who likes working from home, somebody who has chosen to work from home and doesn't have a disability, at which point the amount of time that you can commit to becomes pertinent as well, because an employer, given a choice between an employee working from home who can commit without doubt or problem to 38 hours a week, 40 hours a week, or 20 hours a week, the candidate who can commit to that completely is going to be preferable to the candidate who can't, unless we undertake a cultural review of employment practices, which would be expensive. 10:36 is the time. So I tried for about 5 minutes this morning to be sincerely open to the idea that this is a much needed policy designed to address a genuine problem. And if you think you can help me with that, I would love you to call in, because I failed and I talked myself out of it in the space of one single introduction. The more that I read the words, particularly the threat of removing money from people who are already living on very little, I just found myself persuading myself that it's not a genuine attempt to solve a genuine problem, which of course begs the question, what is it then? 10:36 is the time. Ned's in Colchester. Ned, what would you like to say?
Hey James, good to talk to you again, mate. So you've hit one nail on the head. I called in about the amount of jobs that are out there, and you mentioned particularly, is there a queue of employers? So I am on read.co.uk right now.
Okay.
I'm a 51-year-old man today. Happy birthday to me.
Oh, well, mate, happy birthday, seriously.
Thank you very much. And I'm working from home. I'm contracting. I have 25 years experience within sales. We spoke before about cold calling. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes, I do remember that.
And so I'm looking at read.co.uk, which is, I used to work for them back in the city way back when. We talked about that when I talked about the calling. But at the moment there is work from home jobs, 7,987 you can apply for.
Right.
The majority, 1,500 plus, are in IT and telecoms. Next is sales, engineering, financial services, insurance, and the list goes on. It goes down to the hundreds. Now, the issue we've got here, as you've alluded to, is we had a policy, didn't we, about getting the over 50s back in to work because they were all retired, and we've got this huge workforce challenge. So I'm finding it really difficult to find a permanent role, because the way that employers recruit these days is that they look very much within their own pond of specialisms. So if I want to work in IT and telecoms, I have to have worked in IT and telecoms.
Right.
Sales are the next one on the list. Well, that's what I do.
Yes.
But if I do sales, they want sales in automotive or in bioscience or whatever. They don't want sales from estate agency.
I understand.
So,
yes.
They'll only look, even as an able-bodied man with 25 years plus experience, they'll only look at the people they want to see from their particular pond. So that's what you're up against just to begin with. If I was, had needs, for example, and as you've just discussed, would it go for the able-bodied person first? Probably, right? In the same way that they'd rather go.
A form of discrimination, isn't it? But it
is
transparent, I suppose, rather than hidden. So I don't want to sound naive. The figure they've got is that 2.4 million people. The prerequisites we've established, you've probably just added to. So you have to be capable of working from home, and there has to be a job that fits your capabilities that is currently available, and that is going to feed back into what those capabilities are. So it's not just I'm capable of sitting in front of a screen all day. You need to have other skills as well, which again narrows the pond.
Correct. For example, engineering is the third on the list. There's 608. You can't just walk in and do an engineering job. You've got to have a degree.
So let's come at it from the other angle, mate. What are the jobs that someone who's been out of the work for a while has not got immediately obvious transferable skills? What sort of job might be available for someone with chronic illness or someone on incapacity benefit that they could do from a standing start, as it were?
Here's what you can do, basically, is you ask your friends, family and network and say, have you got anything that I could do? Because if I look back to you just mentioned the word transferable skills. Now, that is possibly the biggest lie in all of job hunting and recruitment, because as I said, since 2008, I've drone on about this a bit. When the financial crash happened, people started to listen. We're not hiring. Well, we are hiring, but you've got to have a black book of contacts. You've got to hit the ground running, which you see in things. There's been a massive lack of training and sort of skill transfer. So people, for example, I mean, I worked in recruitment, and certainly with recruitment agencies, and people would ring up and say, well, look, I've been a lawyer, I fancy being a stockbroker. And I said, they're just not going to look at you. I mean, you've got a good degree or what have you, but you're not. They just want people from their own background. So I looked down the list. We've got the magical admin, secretarial, and PA.
Yeah.
There's 142 of them. Right. And then if I went down to the next thing, charity and voluntary maybe. So my suggestion is, you can apply all day on LinkedIn or going for adverts, unless they say, we are taking in a certain amount of people with this for these type of roles. Let's open it up and they can do this in a way that says, well, we're a progressive employer. Yeah. We really recognise this. We really value you.
Of course. It is both ends of the telescope, isn't it? And the government only seems to be looking through one. And then you've also reminded us that of that 2.4 million people, a lot will be trying and failing to find work, or will have tried and failed to find work. It creates the idea. He talks about a national scandal. His exact words: a national scandal. We will clamp down on welfare fraudsters in the same sentence, talking about the taxpayers who fund it. And there's no reason why the figure of 2.4 million should be thrown into the mix, unless you're trying to create the idea in the minds of some members of the public that there's 2.5 million people out there taking the proverbial
swinging the legislature. Come on. We've been here long enough. This is pure Daily Mail front page fodder.
It's the Times now, mate. I'm afraid it's as I detail in the new book, the decline of previously rather more respectable newspapers is all part of the current process. And the Times, of course, is edited now by a bloke who used to be deputy editor of the Daily Mail and editor of the Daily Telegraph and editor of the Sun. So make of that what you will. 10:42 is the time. Ned, take care, mate. Thanks for that. And happy birthday. Leanne is in Bexley Heath. Leanne, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I'm a bit nervous.
Don't be. It's only me.
It's
only me.
If I can make myself understood without getting emotional. I just tuned in and heard about this policy, and I just wanted to give my story, really, because it's quite close to my heart. I turned 31 last month, and I've been living with various chronic illnesses for most of my life, including sort of pain ones. But back in after I was doing a chemistry degree, and just to the end of the last year of that, my father died, and so I had exams and dissertations and all that, and so it's kind of really uber stressful. Yes. But I got through, and I started my PhD after that. But I started within a year. I started to develop chronic fatigue. It's so difficult to explain about. It's just so much more than fatigue. But basically, it meant I was trying to work to do my PhD through it. Eventually, I had to move back home, and I had to withdraw from it. Right. And now I've been living at home for a few years. My mum is my registered carer.
So she gets £69 a week to look after you.
So, something like that, yeah. And I get personal independence payment.
So what do you get to live on?
It's about £280 a month.
How are they going to take £4,680 a year off you if you don't prove that you're looking for work?
Well, I don't know. I'm in the process of applying for universal credit now, and as part of that, I have to do the sort of a CV and things. But all I've ever wanted to do is to work, is to have a career and do the best I could. But I've been completely hampered.
No, of course you have, and this is the weird thing about Sunak's rhetoric. He's talking about as if you've made a choice to be in the situation that you're in, talking about that we believe in the inherent dignity of a good job. We believe that work, not welfare, is the best route out of poverty. It is all designed to portray you as choosing to be living in the circumstances that you're living in, which could not be further from the truth.
No, absolutely not.
It's extraordinary.
I do think it's partly because we're easy targets.
Clearly.
I don't know, but it's, we don't have all the money. When the vast, as you said before, the vast majority of people are claiming it absolutely legitimately, and it is a very small amount. I mean,
well, he's not even really talking about the people who. I mean, that's a separate issue. He talks about clamping down on fraudsters, but the conversation about the dignity of a good job is not designed. It's not aimed at the fraudsters. It's aimed at you. It's aimed at the what could, I mean, day to day, could you do? I appreciate it's a bit. It's not exactly what you were dreaming of when you signed up to do a PhD, but could you do, data entry? Would you be able to do that?
With a lot of difficulty.
Yeah.
I mean, it's taken me. I've been working on the CV that they've assigned me for almost a month.
Because you're knackered all the time. Because you literally feel like you're swimming through cement. Yeah,
literally, it really is like that. And I've often thought this, that if it wasn't for my mum, I think I would actually be homeless. I wouldn't have enough money to live on.
And then you'd be in all sorts of bother. And now they're saying, get yourself a job or we'll take away what you do have. Leanne, sorry, I really am. But thank you as well, just for highlighting the reality of the existences that Rishi Sunak is trying to portray today. Largely unchallenged. The right-wing media love nothing more than an invitation to stick the boot into vulnerable people, whether they're refugees or our own. That's the other thing, isn't it? When you've got the rhetoric surrounding refugees coming out of your mouth fully formed with the little flecks of spittle, and you claim we want to look after our own. This is an attack on our own. But no one seems to care about that, suddenly. Bizarre. 10:47 is the time. 10:51 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where Rishi Sunak has identified a national scandal. It's a bit like one of Liz Truss's disgraces. It's 2.4 million people who he wants you to believe are largely choosing to live lives of dependence as opposed to independence. They are incapable through mobility or mental health problems, illnesses, to hold down a regular job in a regular workplace. And they're currently in receipt of, it would generally be universal credit with the allowance on top of that, the work capability component in universal credit that works out at about £390 a month. Times that by 12 and you get the 4,680 quid that Rishi Sunak is threatening to take away from people who don't prove that they're looking for work. And I just wonder whether or not you think this is a real problem. Front page of the Times, major part of Sunak's policy platform, a speech about it yesterday. Jeremy Hunt likely to include it in the autumn budget tomorrow. And the more I read it, the more I see how it's framed, and that might be the fault of the media that's given these stories, as opposed to perhaps what the policy is in the wild. The more it's framed, the more it looks like an attempt to demonise the people claiming incapacity benefits by very much promoting the notion that they are doing so through choice. This is quite interesting from one of my favourite Twitter accounts, a chap called Mike who runs a Trumpton Twitter account. He writes, I was recently turned down for a job because as a 56-year-old with blood cancer, when asked where do you see yourself in 5 years, I replied, hopefully alive. They felt I didn't show enough ambition. Josh is in Bristol. Josh, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I actually work with a lot of people with learning disabilities, autism, mental health. So I work a lot with universal credit, DWP, etc.
Yes.
I think the first thing to say is if this was a genuine policy, it just wouldn't work. I mean, the reason I say it is what we do in our line of work has to be person-centred, which means taking every single person as they are,
yes,
with all their nuances, all their differences. UC and DWP do not do this. I mean, I worked recently with a young lad with autism and a learning disability.
Right.
When he was speaking to the people at UC doing his work capability assessment, it was black and white. There was no nuance. There was no taking into account the sort of differences he has as someone who's who's got autism, who's got a learning disability.
Neurodivergent.
When they're asking, yes, neurodivergent. When they're asking him certain things, to him, his independence is so important to him. So he was answering, making sure he was as independent as possible, going overboard and saying, yeah, I can do this. I do this all on my own. which isn't the case.
Bless
Now,
him.
I know this is
so he'd lose
one person.
He'd lose his
Yes,
allowance as a consequence of trying to convince them that he's more capable of work than he actually is, because
100%.
in his own mind, that is a proof that he's independent and he doesn't, I'd never thought. And you're right, but there might not be many people like him in that position,
No.
but there are people like him in that position, and because you know him.
Yeah. That's it, and he's not the only person I've worked with like that, but this is just the most recent one. The other side of things is a lot of these people, especially with learning disabilities, their ability to take in, retain information is very, very, it's a lot lower than the standard population. So when they've got a half-hour phone call or a 40-minute phone call to express why it is that they struggle to work, they can't get that point across. I mean, luckily for the guys we work with, they've got a support worker there with them to maybe go over things or sort of explain things better to them or the person on the other end of the phone. A lot of people don't have that. There's not the finances in place for every single person to have that. So I think a lot of people, we've had people come to us and on their universal credit, they said, well, this person's capable to go back to work tomorrow.
Yes.
And you just
when you've got
the good person, no, it's just absolutely no way.
But they're the people that are going to get hit, aren't they? They're the people. I mean, if this does come in, they're going to lose £4,680 a year.
Yes. And people, say, there's a lot of benefit scams and all that. Well, to be honest with you, this wouldn't change that. It's a very, very minimal amount of people anyway, but those people that are doing it, they're not going to be the ones getting caught out. It's going to be those that actually are struggling and those that are struggling to get their point across.
They must know that.
Yes, I think that is the case. But again, I don't know if this is a genuine policy or, again, just trying to appeal to certain demographics and certain people that think this is a major issue in the country, which I don't think it is.
I think the most recent figures have got fraud at about 3.1%. So 3.6% of total expenditure was overpaid due to fraud and error. So you need that breaking down, because everyone knows a story about an error. And then you knock off another 1.4% because that was underpaid due to fraud and error. So really they need to remove the error from this. So the net loss to the DWP is 3.1% of total benefit expenditure, which is too high. It would be great if it was zero, but that the 2.4 million people in receipt of incapacity benefits are not. They shouldn't be conflated with that tiny number of frauds. So it's just bizarre. And you raised so many interesting points about the individual experience of being in this situation that you do wonder precisely who it is designed to help, if help is the right word. I'm a 42, this is from Steve, that's not his real name, registered disabled, degenerative spinal condition that badly affects my legs. I live off PIP and universal credit. Such is the extent of the demonisation of disabled people that I don't tell anyone except for my closest family, as I feel embarrassed that I'm unable to work, so I lie and tell them that I work from home. I did not ask for or want this condition. 10:57 is the time. Laura Trott, a government minister, has described it as Steve's duty. It's the duty to work. That's a slightly unpleasant choice of word, isn't it? Andrew's in London Bridge. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. So I want to talk about it from an employer's perspective. So obviously, the people that you're speaking to at the moment all seem like they are going to be penalised by, this new investigation or this new take on the benefit system. I've employed over 100 people in a relatively short space of time, at one point 50, 60 people at a time. Yeah. And I can tell you categorically that universal credit is a way of life for a lot of people. There is so many examples I could give.
These are people on incapacity benefits, are they?
Yeah, these are people on various benefits, and what they will do is they will firstly choose, because working is very much flexible these days. So first of all, they would choose how many hours they want to work. Then
this is a policy aimed at people that aren't working any hours.
My point is that there are...
But it has to be a point that's relevant to the 2.4 million people who aren't working any hours. Otherwise, you've rung the wrong show.
It's people that are claiming a benefit rather than working.
Right, but you've employed them.
Well, we've employed them, and we want to employ them. We could employ them on 5 days a week.
They're working and not working at the same time.
Well, they're working the amount of hours that they need to in order to receive a benefit.
But this is a conversation about people who aren't working any hours at all. I think you're getting tax credits mixed up with universal credit.
No. This is universal credit.
Because there's no minimum hours on universal credit. It's only, I think it's 20 hours that tax credits and some other benefits kick in. But what you've done is ring a radio phone in about people who aren't working any hours at all and are being threatened with a £4,680 reduction in their living expenses, to tell me stories about people who are trying to reduce the amount of hours they work because then the universal credit kicks in, and by combining the two they can have a slightly easier life. So do you see what you've done?
Well, I see what your producer's done.
No, you've rung in.
The information.
You've rung in to the same phone in that everybody else has been listening to, but you've rung in to talk about people that this policy has got nothing to do with.
Well, I disagree, because if you're on universal credit...
Yeah, we're talking about people on incapacity benefit who are not working.
Do you not think that the system for these people is being...
I'm just going to repeat what I said. We're talking about people on incapacity benefit who are not working. The people you employ are by definition not the people that we're talking about. But your brain has been so boiled by tabloid bile that you're convinced that what you have to bring to this conversation is somehow relevant to the story that we've spent an hour discussing.
I think my point is
Well, I don't think you do.
The universal credit system, which is not
what we're talking about today.
Well, the benefit system.
We're talking about people on incapacity benefits who do not work because they have been adjudged too ill. Their work capability assessment has delivered them £4,680 a year as a consequence of not being able to work at all. But here you are.
All right, James. Thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it hasn't for me. It's been pretty grim, actually, to think that you could listen to this hour of radio and come up with that contribution.
No, I didn't. I didn't.
Well, mind, there you go. It's 11:01. It is 5 minutes after 11. A headline I forgot to share with you in the last hour. It really caught my UK worse than Rwanda for accessing a GP. Seeing a GP quickly is easier in Rwanda than Britain, a study has found. Make of that what you will, but... just a slightly traffic-stopping headline, isn't it? But anyway, at least Rishi Sunak's got his priorities sorted, and he's going after people who are too sick to work. I'm going to change pace completely now. I like this. I can't believe we haven't done it before. We've kind of touched upon it. There's a temptation. I talked to you about this a bit yesterday. There's a temptation to exaggerate how ignorant you are about modern technology as you get older. Have you noticed this? You're probably still too young, are you? You sort of take on the role of the fuddy-duddy. You start saying things like, "What is the Beatles?" or the internet, the World Wide Web. Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of performative nature to it. I really, really don't want to become that person. It's an example of what I call the bow tie syndrome. What's the bow tie syndrome, James? I'm not sure I've ever told you what the bow tie syndrome is, and I don't want to offend everybody who wears a bow tie, but people who start wearing a bow tie at quite an early age do so as a sort of eccentric affectation. It's an attempt to sort of stand out from the crowd. And at a very early age, it works as an eccentric affectation, you know. When I was on the gossip columns, one fellow had a pocket watch. And he was a bit of an old fogey, a young fogey, but it was kind of charming. A pocket watch is different from a bow tie because you think that you are wearing a bow tie ironically, and then suddenly you are just a person in a bow tie. You are just a prat in a bow tie. But you start doing it ironically, and then it just becomes... It starts as irony and it ends as pomposity. But the speed with which you move from irony to pomposity is breathtaking to the outside world, even though to you may never realise that you've arrived at pomposity. I speak as someone who has flirted perhaps with lifestyle choices of this nature, but always hopefully I'm just naturally so scruffy. That's the problem I've got. I'm one of those people that can put on freshly pressed clothes at 7 o'clock in the morning and look like I've been dragged through a hedge backwards by past. I don't know why it is. So posture or something, I don't know. So I don't want to be that fake fuddy-duddy. I don't want to start off ironically pretending that I'm not up to date, I'm not au fait with the latest modern technologies, and then not notice that I've actually just become a pompous old so-and-so who doesn't keep up with modern technologies. Do you see am I making sense? Do you see what I mean? I don't. So I can always feel the temptation there to sort of pretend not to know what AI is. So if I express ignorance about modern technology, I suppose what I am saying to you is that, I'm sorry, David, I'm so sorry. David's just texted me to say my son wore a bow tie to school last week. He's 5 years old. I don't mean him. I categorically don't mean him. There's something really cute about kids in bow ties. They look smart. They look fantastic. Oh, no. Paige, that's better. She says, you're making me think of Tucker Carlson. He's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Starts off as irony, ends up being pomposity. Not David's little boy. I think that's terrible. I think that's it. And you, I don't mean you either, Elliot. If it's compulsory because of the choir that you're in, then it's a dress code. It's not a lifestyle choice, is it? So no, I'm not backing down on this one. This is a hill that I'm prepared to die on. Bow ties on grown-ups, unless it's a dress code. Pompous. Unless it's a black tie. Oh, shut up. Anyway, if I say that I don't understand a modern technology, it's because I genuinely don't understand a modern technology. If you ever catch me sort of talking about the Facebook or something like that, then give me a slap. You have my permission in advance. And AI is something that we've been talking about a lot. We've been on a bit of a journey together. We've got some regular callers on AI who know quite a lot about it, and they've helped the rest of us come to a better understanding. I don't think I want to talk to them today. I want to talk about something that many, many people listening will actually, whether they realise it or not, will actually have knowledge of, have understanding of. I want to talk about children using it to help with their homework, or students using it, because this goes way into undergraduate areas. 4,000 people aged between 8 and 25 have been quizzed by Opinium, the pollsters, and well over half have used a chat bot, an AI chat bot such as ChatGPT, to help them with schoolwork, emails, or their job. And 10 minutes after 11 is the time. And I am usually quite careful to avoid moral panics. I always think of calculators at this point. This isn't me being a bogus fuddy-duddy, by the way. I'm of an age where the ability to take calculators into maths exams was discussed when I was younger. You know, I don't think we were the first cohort to do it, but there was a belief that it was a bad thing to do because it robbed children of the necessity and therefore the ability to do complicated arithmetic in their head or on paper. Well, if you can take a calculator into an exam, then most questions you'll get in a maths exam at a younger age become fairly pointless. So at what age do you let them... do you see what I mean? So it's a bit of a silly moral panic. The same with the internet. It's why we invented Mystery Hour. You don't need to know stuff like you used to. It's still nice to collect knowledge. You can name the 6 wives of Henry VIII. It's nice. It's good to have knowledge. But you can if someone who's doing it from memory and someone who's doing it from Google in a race are going to be neck and neck, aren't they? But maybe not quite neck and neck. Let's just see. 6... There we go. So I've got it in front of me now. And you could do Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn. I can't remember the other 2. I should have Googled it, the other 4. Of course I can. Jane Seymour, Catherine Parr, the other one, and that one there. Go and see the musical. That'll better stick it in your head very effectively. So you don't... So again, I used to be, the internet, children aren't going to know stuff anymore. But they still know stuff. They still need to know stuff for exams. They just need to know stuff in a different way from children who grew up in a world without the internet. And that's why I don't, at the moment, feel a huge sense of panic at the news that students, and I'd like to focus on students rather than jobs, schoolwork and university work, using ChatGPT. There's even a check you can do. And this is one of those lovely topics where people are going to either going to know quite a lot or next to nothing about it, I suspect. There's not going to be many of us in the middle. But you can do a check on whether or not the work is original. My daughters have been explaining this to me. And obviously, you don't want your teachers to think that you've got all of your homework off ChatGPT, but you can get a skeleton around which you do the work. You can get a plan for an essay or an idea of how the essay may proceed. So I've got two questions for you, really. Have you used it to do your schoolwork? 0345 6060 973. Have you used a ChatGPT or another AI chatbot to help with your schoolwork? And that might not seem like a particularly interesting question to you because it's so commonplace, but trust me, for the rest of us, it's absolutely fascinating. Imagine someone who'd managed to get a degree in the world before chatbots, discovering today how much work is or could be done by the technology. 0345 6060 973. And then, I don't know who's best qualified to answer the next question. Let's just say everybody is. How big a problem is it? No, wrong question. Should have got ChatGPT to come up with this. Is it a problem? I'm not sure it is. But then again, my experiences are limited. Essentially, my children have talked me through how they use it in the context of their schoolwork, and I've been quite impressed. It's almost like a sort of an aid memoir or a catalyst, an accelerator of the work that they need to do. It helps them with the work that they do. And when they get to the end of their work, they have learnt as much or done as much as they would have done without it. But it helps them use their time more efficiently. It's a bit like an index. It's a bit like knowing where to go for what you need. But if I was a teacher, I'd probably have a slightly different attitude. Teachers are going to be at the front of the queue for this one. Can you tell when a kid hasn't really done any work at all? Because that seems to be a problem. Or is the technology already running away with us? So the technology is now being programmed in order to disguise the fact that you've used the technology to do the work that you should have done yourself. 0345 6060 973. Is anyone prepared to tell me that their PhD thesis was largely constructed from ChatGPT? And presumably the parameters that you put in determine what comes out. So by tweaking the parameters, you can disguise the fact that you haven't done the heavy lifting. I guess I'm trying to work out what plagiarism would be in the context of something that the technology you've programmed has essentially invented. That's not plagiarism, is it, in the traditional sense of the word? So what is it? So what have you used it for in the context of school or college or university? And that is either from the student or the teacher's point of view. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And is it a problem? I don't normally ask questions as neutral as that, but so I'll add to that in brackets. I'm not sure it is, but I'm pretty confident I could present it as one if I was writing for the Daily Mail. I could make it sound like the end of civilization as we know it. The youth are revolted. Do you know Thucydides in about the 6th century BC? Thucydides was writing about how children no longer have respect for their elders. Over 2,500 years ago. There's nothing new under the sun. And that's what I mean by a moral panic. You know, video was supposed to kill the radio star, but I'm still here. There are video games that were supposed to signal the end of civilization as we know it, but now your nan plays them, probably. Does a Sudokus on her phone and stuff like that. So all of it, you know, movies, films, everything was supposed to bring about the end of civilization as we know it. Calculators, a few of you getting in touch to tell me that you had teachers who used to have a huge problem with calculators. School in the 90s, one of our teachers would say, no calculators! You won't be walking around with one in your pocket when you're older. But here we are, says Luke from Burton. And that's a really good point. Yeah, people have got them on their watch. You remember when the kid turned up at school with a calculator on his watch? This has got to be my age to be amazed by this. Now, you've got Apple Watches now that can do things you needed a computer the size of a house to do when I was a teenager. I remember the lad turned up with a calculator, a Casio with a calculator. He's got a calculator on his watch. That's amazing. It's absolute. Never used it. Never ever used it. What are you going to use it for? First of all, you need a pin to press the buttons in. Well, you've got a calculator on your desk. What are you going to use your watch for? But I love that. The teacher saying, you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket when you're walking around as an adult, are you? Hey? Yes, actually. So I don't know. What do we put ChatGPT under? What do we file it under? Do we file it under calculators on your wristwatch, or do we file it under internet or calculators in exams? It's just going to be such a commonplace part of the student experience and indeed the teaching experience that any attempt to portray it as a threat to the status quo or a threat to civilization as we know it is going to be a little bit daft. Your thoughts? So your experiences and your thoughts. Is it a big problem in classrooms, or am I right in thinking that it's actually just another example of technology making things a bit easier and certainly a bit different? It's 11:17. It is 20 minutes after 11, and categorically not casting myself in the role of the fake fuddy-duddy. I don't know a great deal about what you might use ChatGPT for in the classroom or the lecture theatre, and I'd like you to tell me. We don't have to have a row on every subject that we talk about. I know some people quite like the rows, but generally speaking, it's an exercise in illumination and elucidation, this programme. So we can just educate each other a bit today. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Sarah's in Stockport. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm a primary school teacher at the moment on maternity leave, but I use GPT all the time to help me with work and have used it in the classroom, and I think it is brilliant. The amount of time it has saved me creating worksheets, resources, letters. Obviously, I go back over it and amend it and make sure it's appropriate for the children.
Yes.
The children use it for translating. The children use it to look at good models of writing. It is brilliant, and I love it.
So there's no downside at all? Is it making you lazy?
No, I don't think so, because you still put the information in, you still check it. But if the children were doing a piece of writing on the Romans, perhaps, they would still have to do a lot of the research. So GPT is just fine-tuning that research. They'll read it through, they'll pick out the facts that they like, they'll look at the good sentence structures. I think it's really helpful.
Can you explain to someone who's never been near it how you use it?
If I wanted to create, a worksheet or some questions for a text, I'd type in the name of the text and I'd just put create 5 Viper questions or 5 vocabulary questions on this text, and it will just list the questions and it will just come up with them. And I have to say, they are brilliant.
Really?
It's not.
So this is what is meant by artificial intelligence. But for people who see the internet now as a huge reference library, this goes the next step, doesn't it? This consults the reference library and comes back with something quite specific that you've asked for.
It's incredibly clever, because you could even type in, a specific book perhaps we're doing in guided reading, and I say I want some inference deduction questions, explanation questions, and it will list them. I'll go back and change it to make sure it's friendly for the children. I don't just blindly print it off, but that it has saved hours and hours and hours of manually typing out questions and manually.
So it's the grind, really. So the questions that the children are being asked are as good or better than the ones you would have come up with yourself. They're just as good as, because I would go back and amend them. Yeah. Where needed, yeah, definitely. So the children's experience is just as educational or illuminating as it would be, but you've just saved several hours of graft, effectively.
But what's interesting is, on the calculator question, we're not allowed to use calculators at primary school level. The children don't use them for their SATs in the end of year. So we can use all of this incredible technology, but for maths, we're not allowed to use them. No, but
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Definitely.
I mean, because you need to be able to do some
sure.
sums. Yes, exactly that. Whereas ChatGPT does something very different. It fills in gaps rather than provide. Well, it could provide the answers, I suppose, if the children were using it. The ChatGPT comes up with the questions and the answers. And I'm laughing, but that is, of course, what some people are referring to when they talk about it rendering humanity redundant. You wouldn't need to set up. Anyway, I digress. Sarah, thank you. Nathan's in Kingston. Nathan, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, James. I guess for me, because I'm an adult student, and I think for me it's more of like an integrity thing.
Yes. Tell me more.
I've used ChatGPT. I hope I'm not incriminating myself by saying that, but I've used ChatGPT for writing essays, but I'm not just going to go into ChatGPT and then sort of copy and paste like a 500-word essay on, say, the history of funk. But I guess if it comes to sort of, structuring the essay, then I might ask AI to be like, give me a couple of questions that I could answer in this. But then also I do. But
that's fine. The second example's fine, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think so, but I don't know, because you also get a lot of AI. I think you've got AI checkers that are coming into play. Into education soon. But I don't see an issue with it personally. But I don't know. I guess for me, it's also like.
Have you ever felt guilty? Have you ever asked it to do something that you... I think in my head, am I hindering my... Yeah, that's what I mean.
I mean, I think, for me, it's more of like, I don't know, I guess for me, it's also like, have you ever felt guilty? Have you ever asked it to do something that you...
Yeah, that's what I mean. Am I hindering my sort of Oh, the phone line keeps kicking in and out, Nathan. I don't know whether that's technological or analogue. 25 minutes after 11 is the time. Caitlin's in Streatham. Caitlin, what would you like to say?
I think there are a lot of benefits to it. Like, it saves a lot of time, but there's also a lot of negatives, because obviously if you're not going through what the answers that the ChatGPT has given you, you're not really doing the work yourself. Like, I'm in college, and I know a lot of other people who do use ChatGPT and just copy and paste the answers.
The whole thing. So you could type in. What are you studying? Do you mind me asking? Is it essay questions?
I'm studying health and social care, so there's a lot of different aspects in it. But, like, for example, like if there's an essay on, I don't know, the anatomy of your body, you can literally type in the question and it will give you the full essay.
But the teacher would know, wouldn't they? Or would they?
Well, no, because it depends. If they know, obviously, your writing style, then they'd know. But it doesn't go through plagiarism checkers.
Right.
It doesn't show plagiarised. So
but it will. I mean, that will change, won't it, as the technology becomes more common? I think that the checks and balances will be put, but then the technology will find its way around the technology. So where would you draw the line then? What have you ever done anything that made you feel guilty? Did you ever think, I've used it too much there? I've used it for more than I should have done? Yeah, I think so. But only when I already know the knowledge. Like, if I already know, like, there was a whole table to fill out on the anatomy of the body, and I already knew all the answers. But it just saved time. Like, I just copied out the whole table. It saved time, but if someone who doesn't know that knowledge is doing that, then you're not really learning anything. How feasible is it that there could be 20 students in a lecture theatre, and a teacher has set an essay, and all 20 students have used ChatGPT to do 80% or more of the work involved, and the teacher wouldn't know?
I reckon it's pretty likely.
Really? So, and you're what, 18, did you say?
Yeah.
So you're right on the cusp of it, aren't you? It's your generation that the technology is moving so quickly when you're right in the middle of your educational years. That's fascinating. So you're a mixture of fan and fear.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess that's where everybody should be. Thank you, Caitlin. Good luck with your studies. Where is that line then for the uninitiated? Where is the line between it's a great help and it's actually becoming, I love Nathan's use of the word integrity, it's becoming something that is dishonourable? When does it become dishonourable or deceitful to use the technology to do the work? Teachers, I haven't heard enough from teachers of older students, sorry, Caitlin's not a child, but teachers of older students, so sixth form or above, whether or not, because I've told you many times, I was not a great student. I was quite lazy. And I still have anxiety dreams about having essay crisis. Do you remember essay crises even? Did you ever have an essay crisis? I get so behind on my work that you'd have to eat Nescafe, like spoon Nescafe into your gob. Do you remember Pro Plus? Did anyone else take? And stay up all night and write 4 essays, which largely involved borrowing your mates who'd done them and rewriting what your mate had written in your own, which is, I guess, what ChatGPT is in a sense, a sort of analog version of ChatGPT. And that was cheating. But I would learn quite a lot while rewriting my mate's essay. Sometimes I'd get a better grade than the bloke I'd borrowed the essay off, which was always quite amusing, because you do the heavy. He'd done the heavy lifting, and I could do the lighter frills around. I don't know. When does it become dishonourable? At what point does it become deceitful? 0345 6060 973. And if you're a lecturer or a teacher of older students, I want to know what's going on in your world. This is helpful. A high detection rate is generated. As a lecturer, I have to check 2 things before reporting it to my supervisors. Do the references exist? Or where have they come from? So you're checking the references. And are there sudden changes in the style of writing? I like this. It is 11:34. Jason's in Bristol. He says, I think that the ChatGPT phenomenon may be more of a problem for the arts than the sciences. One of my engineering professors was convinced he could give students the question and the answer, and many still wouldn't be able to link the two together. At the moment, AI is more about the appearance of intelligence. And Ash, who is a regular Mystery Hour contributor on Matters Maritime, tells us that if you want a parallel from teaching, which is what he does, it's the same panic reflected by the older lecturers for ship stability. They reject the use of a stability computer on board ships and maintain that you must work out all the calculations yourself by hand. In a commercial setting, there just isn't the time anymore, and the computer programs can do 2 hours work in seconds, leaving more time for safety checks and briefings that were often overlooked in the good old days. And then, of course, the next chapter of that story could involve the safety checks and the briefings being phased out or going back to what happened in the good old days. So the technology speeds up something that currently takes time, and the employer sees it as a cost saving rather than an efficiency improvement, when it could, of course, be both. Steve's in Birmingham. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I'd like to say I just tuned in actually and listened to you talking about the ChatGPT thing.
Yes.
And I teach in a fairly major university, and
excellent.
Every week, without fail, a student will present me with a draft for coursework that has been written on ChatGPT, that is AI written. And usually straight away you can look at it and I can sort of have a quiet word with the student and say, look, it's due in 2 weeks, and we both know who's generated this, right?
Do they ever deny it? Do they ever deny it?
They'll always deny it at first,
right.
And then we just have a bit more of an in-depth chat, and they'll change their mind, and they'll kind of call it out. But what I wanted to bring up with you today is not so much the availability of the technology, but it's more the normalisation of it that I think is becoming a problem.
Okay.
So a lot of students are seeing this as, well, this is normal technology now, so what's wrong with using it? Do you understand what I mean by that? And
so of course I do.
Prior to the AI thing, we've had a piece of software for a long time that checks for plagiarism. And I would say at least once a day, a student will say to me, "How much similarity is the maximum that can see on my script?" You know, when they submit a piece of work.
Yeah.
So we've got over the plagiarism thing now, and now we're into the generation. You know,
so they're almost seeing that the challenge for them is to disguise how much they've borrowed.
Yeah.
They don't even see it as you shouldn't be borrowing. It's evolved into the challenges to camouflage the plagiarism.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. So I know it's your. I mean, you've stopped me in my tracks a bit there. So they're so. I mean, bold isn't even the word, because they don't think they're doing anything extraordinary, but it's so it's so normalised. They'll come and ask the teacher. They'll come and ask the lecturer for advice on how much camouflage they need.
That was pre-AI, so that was just with similarity, right? We're just with plagiarism, borrowing from different scripts or wherever.
Yes.
But the AI thing, they've now started to ask, is it okay to use AI to produce these pieces of work? And what I always say to them now is, look, you know what? If AI will generate something for you to look at for inspiration, that's fine. But people like me can tell straight away that that's not your work. So as a result of that, James, we've had to start adjusting the way that we produce assessment briefs now. Okay, so when you and I were at university, probably roughly at the same time in the late 90s, the lecturer would write the module leader or whatever.
I'm a bit older than you, but no, that doesn't matter.
Right, no, I think you're not actually. I think we're roughly the same age, right? But so the module leaders or the course leaders would generate an assignment, and the students would go away and do it. Okay. But now we're having to adapt the assignment briefs to something that AI can't generate.
Oh, how do you do that then?
So for instance, I've got an assignment that's actually due in on Sunday night this week, right? And I've had to come up with 4 case studies that the student needs to write about, and I've had to make up those case studies from scratch, so they can't be linked to anything that's already out there.
Can I not just put that into ChatGPT? Your case study?
Yeah, of course you could, but I've written things into the case study that can't be generated.
Right.
So very specific details in the case study. So the student at least needs to read the case study. The problem is with AI is the more people use it, the more intelligent it gets.
Yes, of course.
on its own, if you like. And to kind of, I hate to admit this, but I've generated 4 case studies for my current assignment, and I got AI to write those case studies for me.
Physician, heal thyself.
Right, but then I went through them with a fine-tooth comb and adapted them. All I did was come up with the structure. I said, right,
but
I don't think words
you,
on this.
But you've not done anything wrong there, have you, really?
No, not at all. No, I haven't done anything. I'm just kind of admitting to it.
But you're highlighting the difficulty of knowing exactly where the line is, because if I was doing an assignment for you and I used AI in the same way that you used it to set the assignment, we'd both be okay, I think. Or not?
Not necessarily, no, because I've only generated a 400 or 500 word passage to use as an inspiration. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're not handing that in to be marked as your own work, as it were.
No. I'm just using that. I'm telling the students to go and write me a 3,000 word report based upon some of the information that's in those passages, in those case studies. But I think because I know you need to move on. But
not really. Actually, that's the nice thing about this show. If you're really interested, you can have as much time as you want.
Oh, okay. Well, the 2 points then, if you like, that I want to make. One is, for 20 years, we've had issues with plagiarism, actual ordinary plagiarism. Borrowing coursework, borrowing websites, books, whatever it is. And now it's become so normalised that I actually teach that. I show examples of plagiarised work, and I say, look, this is what I'm looking for. This is what will flag it with me. This is what will cause you a problem. And I always say to students, if you're confident it's your own work, you've nothing to worry about.
Right.
But the AI thing has just took it to another level now. Another thing some colleagues of mine are doing, they're actually getting rid of hand-submitted assignments, and they're moving towards what they call live assessment days, where they won't even give the question out until the day it's due.
Right.
And the students get 8 hours in a classroom to do it under controlled conditions, if you like. And the general sort of consensus, the general consensus with it in the HE sector is that universities are probably going to start providing dedicated IT labs, if you like, computer rooms, where there will be no access to the internet or no access to any outside sources. It'll literally just be a word processor.
For examining purposes.
Yeah, for examining, but you don't have to write with your hands anymore.
Fine.
Because I'm left-handed and my handwriting's shocking. It's worse than any doctor's.
Sure.
So I would fail any assignment that I had to handwrite.
So handwriting is becoming obsolete, but you can't allow the computer that you're using to do the writing to then be a portal into epic plagiarism.
Well,
hang on, but exams were like that when we were at college. You couldn't take anything into an exam with you.
No. But we used to write them, didn't we?
Yeah.
Exams. We used to write them by hand. But while we're moving away, we can't ask students to handwrite anymore. What we're saying is they'll end up with an IT lab that's got no access to anything other than just a word processor.
I get it. Sorry. Yeah, that's different, isn't it? There's two takes. So one is a gateway to the other. I have. Thank you, Steve. That's really helpful. Few people asking. I dare you, says Ben, to ask ChatGPT to write you a morning monologue. We have done, actually, and it was quite convincing. And what was really interesting, Ben, thank you, Steve. That was fascinating, actually. But what was really interesting, Ben, was that we've done it a couple of times, months apart, and it's got noticeably better. And there's quite a lot of me out there, for good or for ill. There's quite a lot of YouTube stuff and examples of it. But it's only drawing on stuff that's gone relatively viral, which is not that representative of the normal show. So it will be a more, I don't know quite what the word is. It will be more like the viral content, which is a small percentage of a 3-hour show, than it will be as an average of the 3-hour show, if you see what I mean. But, that'll change. I squeeze in Mick, who's in Shoeburyness in Essex. Mick, what would you like to say?
Well, I just want to... basically, I'm a first-time caller. Hi, James. How you doing?
Very well, Mick. Welcome aboard.
It's very nice to be on your show. Good answer to Rick, Mr. Ferrari in the mornings. Always look forward to 10 o'clock.
Don't know what you're talking about. Where were we?
Right, yeah. Anyway, ChatGPT. I'm 55 and I'm a professional engineer. And I use ChatGPT, I think one of your previous callers mentioned it, to do the heavy lifting when I'm sort of doing a bit of research or what have you. rather than, I offload some of the more basic tasks onto it. But that said, it does often come back with erroneous results.
For now, I think that gets better and better with each passing day, doesn't it? Really?
There's a little bit of what should we say? A little bit of a shock and awe around AI. The actual ChatGPT learning model, actually, I think it's finished its training. It's no longer trained after events that happened after 2021, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you an example, sort of some basic stuff that ChatGPT gets wrong.
Yeah.
I'll get my teeth in a minute.
Go on.
If you ask it something simple like, what is the area of an equilateral triangle side 15?
Yeah.
And I did this as a little test case. And it reports quite authoritatively that the area is 44.3 square units.
Right.
And I said, well, I know that to be incorrect. So I say, check that answer. He says, certainly, let's double check the answer. And it comes back telling me it's right again, saying that this answer is correct.
Right.
I then explicitly tell it, I say, use the semi-sum formula and show the working. And it goes, certainly. And then it will come up, and then it comes up with the correct answer of 62.7 square units.
Right.
I then ask it, this does not agree with your previous answer. Why? And it apologises to me and let me explain the discrepancy.
Oh.
And it tries to put it down to a rounding error. And I say, and then my reply to that is that's a 30% rounding error. That's not correct. Explain yourself in more detail. And then to cut a long story short, basically, you've got to know what you're doing, and you've got to be able to check the information that ChatGPT throws out to you.
I get it. Speaking of checking the information, quite a few people have jumped on what you said about pre-2021 information. ChatGPT now has the capability to look at live web results as well as to generate images in one of its latest updates. So almost to sort of come full circle on that one. But eventually, I think, and this is the last conversation we had about AI, eventually it's going to be able to do almost all of our jobs. Up to and including this one. I just managed to imbue my delivery with so much humanity that no computer... Well, I don't know who I'm trying to kid with that. It is 10 to 12, and I guess the line is probably in between getting it to do heavy lifting as opposed to getting it to do original work. If you're handing in something that you claim is original work and ChatGPT has done it, then you've crossed the line. Whereas if you're not claiming that it's original work, but you've used it to frame questions or provide structure for work that you've done, then you're okay. Tony, very cleverly, and it also allows me to plug my book, which I haven't done today, I don't think. Tony picks up on a slightly snarky review of my new book in today's Guardian. I think it's only online, which actually is really helpful. I think that's why I sent it in, because it makes the point that we've been exploring. The reviewer wrote, all the same, I often bridled as I read. In part, this had to do with the book's material, which mostly isn't new. Yes, its author has done a lot of reading, but he relies almost entirely for his text on the hard labour, the investigations and the thinking of others, and this annoyed me as a writer and a reader. Well, that annoyed me as a writer and a reader, because I tried to write a book that uses evidence, whether it is from academics or whether it is from other books or biographies. And I work very hard for once in my life on finding references to back up the points that I was making. So I did indeed read a lot. And some criticism of my previous books has been it's just his opinions. There's nothing in there except his opinions. And now I'm getting criticised for having worked too hard to try and find evidence and examples to back up the points that I'm making, which was, I thought, a slightly odd thing to complain about. You can't complain. It's it's out there in the ether. It's better to be, what do they say? Better only one thing worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. But that kind of that is relevant to the ChatGPT conversation, because if it is essentially just sifting through stuff and presenting you with useful stuff that you then work into your original text, that's just speeding up the research process. But if you're just passing stuff from ChatGPT into your work, claiming it's original, then you've crossed a line. I'm just not sure that line is as easy to discern as I thought it would be when we started this conversation. Jacob is in Gloucester. Jacob, what would you like to say?
I work as an assistive technology tutor. So,
gosh, that's quite on message.
It is, yeah. I support them with loads of strategies all the time, and they're becoming more and more AI-based. Those are the ones being granted by the DSA nowadays, the Disabled Student Allowance.
Right.
So, doing this job over the years, I've just seen it become more prevalent, and it helps people so much. And I'm often having a conversation, like even just this morning, the student was very anxious about using AI, but then at the same time really needing my support. So me having to tiptoe that line of really saying, this is going to help you, this is going to address your needs. At the same time, you need to be very wary of, are you growing? Are you expanding? What's going on with your studies? Yeah.
Where do you think the line is then between helpful and worrying?
I think creating original content, like you've already pinpointed already.
Let me be a bit annoying on that.
Go on.
as the technology evolves and improves, won't programming it correctly or giving it the right prompts become a skill in itself? So two people using the same technology for the same purpose are going to come up with different results based upon how good they are at informing or inputting the data that they want ChatGPT to crunch.
That's a title for a profession now. It's called prompt engineer.
The phone line went down. What's the profession called?
A prompt engineer. Yeah. Prompt
engineer. I'm going to have to knock the phone call on the head because the technology might be advancing in some areas of the universe, but phone lines from Gloucester still apparently eluding the finest brains on the planet. A prompt engineer. Did you know that was a thing? I didn't know that was I love it when I do that. I ask a question that I think might make me sound a little bit silly, and it turns out that I'm not silly at all, except, of course, for all the times when it turns out I am actually very, very silly. But, of course, a prompt engineer is going to be doing a better job of prompting ChatGPT than someone else. So that becomes a skill. So it is original work. So programming the ChatGPT, prompt engineering is original work. Oh, I love it when things get more confusing as the conversation continues. Jacob, take care. Cormac is in Cheltenham, just up the road from you. Cormac, what would you like to say?
So I'm an apprentice in computer science.
Oh, yeah.
I'm in my third year at the moment, so I'm doing a year-long placement now. But for the last 2 years, I've been doing just standard university.
Yes.
For a lot of that, I have been using AI to help out with particularly open book exams. So rather than using something like Google to kind of scour the internet, lots of different answers.
So you're looking to I mean, are you cut and pasting, or are you just finding stuff that is helpful to you formulating your answers to questions?
So in the open book exams, it's quite good to get specifically curated information.
Yes.
So rather than relying on what other people have written, you're relying on lots of, like the billions of parameters worth of stuff that the AI has access to, and being able to use that to get a proper answer.
I like that. And at what point? Again, this phone line's not great either. It must be something in Gloucestershire. Where does the worry start? When would you start feeling dishonourable doing what you're doing?
I think at the point where you get it to write, the whole coursework.
And do you have students? Do you have peers who are doing that?
I've seen other people's computers. They have ChatGPT out while we're meant to be kind of writing our own assessments. But I've gotten it to written things like outlines for writing a coursework report, and just being able to kind of speed up that process and the research part of it, particularly now that it has access to the internet and being able to find academic sources easier, is definitely become a useful skill. So I'm currently I've just started writing my dissertation on AI safety in enterprises.
So it's all there.
Using AI to write a report about AI.
Using AI to write a report about AI. And it occurs to me, will AI be able to do its own prompt engineering? You'll have an AI prompt engineer.
Currently, with the image generation that it does, you give it a very basic prompt, and it uses itself to write a much more descriptive one.
Okay. The phone line's gone south again, Cormac. Not your fault, but if I'm struggling to hear you and I've got, whopping great headphones on my head, other people who've got us on in the background will really be struggling. I should have time for at least one more on this. It's a good one, isn't it? I said to you a while ago, we'll come back to this. We'll circle around it. We'll come at it from different angles. We may not even wait for things to be in the news, but there'll always be prompts. And every time we have the conversation, we come away a little bit more informed, than we were before. It's growing a bit like ChatGPT. It's like, well, to show my age, I think of the robot in Short Circuit. The film Short Circuit. I just think more input. Lewis is in Lincoln. More input, please, Lewis.
Hello there.
Hello.
I'm really interested, actually, that you've just got onto the subject of prompt engineering, because that was pretty much what inspired me to phone in. So I'm a university lecturer, and I teach law. So software design and IT is not really my specialist area. But one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is looking at things like miniature assessment models where perhaps prompt engineering is what we assess. So, for example, you've talked with some previous callers about the idea of AI getting things wrong. And, of course, it can do. But I think we need to recognise that sometimes the AI does get things wrong because of us.
Yes,
because we don't know how to ask it the correct questions.
Yes.
Of course, often, if you ask, take a law example, if I asked ChatGPT to give me the current law on dismissals, it will probably review many different jurisdictions' laws and create a model which is perhaps an accumulation of all of them.
Right.
So part of the prompt engineering is learning to say, well, I want you to give me this information relevant to this time, relevant to this scenario, and within this jurisdiction, and you then develop the skills to know how to more effectively craft the correct questions. And I think
that becomes a skill in itself. That becomes a skill in itself.
Absolutely. I think we talk about, you mentioned prompt engineers, which kind of sounds like its own, specific world. But I think it's something that all of us need to become more familiar with. Because certainly what we've done in my institution within our law school is we have updated our referencing guide so that if a student is permitted to use AI in an assessment and we tell them what they're allowed to use it for and how they can use it, we have incorporated a method which they include in their referencing, what AI tool they've used, when they used it, and more importantly, what was the prompt that they gave it. So we can then examine how effectively they posed the right question.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of this comes down to, you talk about where is the line. I think a part of it comes down to the system, whether it's the academic institution or the professional institution, where they say, well, this is where we allow you to use this to this particular extent. And I think that has to be as inclusive as possible.
Of course it does. And it's going to, and it involves, so there's always a danger of thinking that the young people have got the monopoly on the technology or that they're learning it faster. But it is simply a case of the teaching faculty being as across what the students are across as the students are. And therefore you can tell them what they are and are not allowed to do. And then you can come up with the checks and balances for scrutinising what it is that they have done. I'm glad we squeezed you in, Lewis. Thank you for that. It is 12:01. 5 minutes after 12 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to do something a bit different now, something I wasn't actually intending to do. I really like the story Nick was talking about earlier about grandparents being denied access to their grandchildren, but I don't know how repetitive that would be if we did an hour on it. It's essentially going to be the same story with a few wrinkles. I may do it later in the week. I may have another think about that. But and I need to choose my words incredibly carefully, which I don't always do. I am conscious of that. I try to. The front page of the Daily Mirror today contains the foreword, Sunak, let people die. Rishi Sunak allegedly said Number 10 should let COVID deaths soar rather than impose more curbs. This was from Sir Patrick Vallance's testimony yesterday, a diary entry read out at the COVID inquiry. In response to talk of that second lockdown in 2020, Vallance wrote that Johnson wants to let it rip, and Cummings said Rishi thinks just let people die and that's okay. There's some fairly tricky questions to answer about the so-called Eat Out to Help Out campaign that Rishi Sunak did several laps of honour over, but which Sir Patrick Vallance has described as it being highly likely that it drove up deaths. I remember when the numbers came out. It was such a weird time, wasn't it? Such a weird time. Because when it was announced, we all loved it. I know possibly a few people did. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you knew. Actually, that's we took a call from a text actually, about a month ago, from a fellow who had a pub and refused to do it because his wife was a healthcare professional, and she said, this is insane. And he got a right kicking from the community because everyone was desperate to get out and do a bit of socialising, have a meal and a couple of pints. And the village where the pub was one of the only places where they could do that. And he stayed shut, which would have involved A, taking a huge financial hit, and B, becoming public enemy number one for a couple of weeks in the village. But he obviously did the right thing, we now know. And we knew pretty quickly because it kicked in, Eat Out to Help Out, and then the numbers spiked a week later. And it was the strangest thing to sit there and sort of go, oh, I really liked Eat Out to Help Out. And of course it's pushed up numbers. And I want you to hold that thought in your mind. And the other thing I want you to think about is something I often use as an illustration of a cost-benefit ratio. And if you have visited London, or if you're familiar with the Jubilee line in London, then you'll know that a couple of stations, or a few stations, it's in a tube. In fact, the Elizabeth line is like this, completely is like this as well at the underground stations, not the overground ones. But it's in a tube, and I don't mean a tube as in the tube, the London Underground. I mean, it's actually in a tube. So the doors align with other doors. The doors on the trains align with doors on the platform, which completely removes the risk of anybody falling under a train, right? It completely removes that risk. That, I think, is pretty much the only rationale for having a tube within a tube, for having the doors. There's no other reason why you would do that. There's no other benefit I can think of. It prevents people from deliberately throwing themselves under the wheels of a train, but it also removes completely the risk of anybody falling under a train in normal circumstances. So then you ask yourself, well, why don't they have that at all stations, given that it would definitely and measurably save lives? And the answer to that is because it would cost so much. So somebody somewhere is always making a calculation which is in many ways the most brutal calculation of all. It is putting a price on a life. It is saying, of course we could spend £30 billion. I'm making these numbers up. Of course we could spend £30 billion on essentially insulating every railway line in town. But, and yes, it would save 30 lives, but that would be £1 billion per life, lives per year. And you sort of think that's not worth it. No one's going to spend £1 billion to save one life. If even the NHS wouldn't spend £1 billion to save one life if the technology existed. And it's a really brutal calculation, isn't it? It's a really arresting thought that somebody somewhere is constantly doing sums designed effectively to put a price on a human life. And I want you to hold that in your mind as well. Because you know what I said at 10 o'clock this morning? I'll give you a quick reminder if you weren't listening. I said that I find myself trying to resist the urge to be lazy, in my opinions. I don't want to immediately reach for the familiar levers, the levers that we use every day. I failed in the first hour because I couldn't persuade myself that there would be a good faith motivation behind the latest crackdown on people on incapacity benefits, plural. A variety of benefits designed for disabled and poorly people. So I failed on that. I needed a prompt engineer, perhaps, to do a better job than I managed to do. But the gut reaction, the knee-jerk reaction, which is, I guess, what I mean by the lazy levers, the levers that we use most often, on this is to kick off today, to come on air and start shouting the odds about Rishi Sunak being callous and vicious and uncaring, and the Daily Mirror have very much gone for that button. They've hit that button hard. Sunak, let people die. Rishi Sunak allegedly said Number 10 should let COVID deaths soar rather than impose more curbs. Boris Johnson, we know, was talking about letting the bodies pile high. He went perhaps a little further when he talked about people having had a good innings. It's only old people that are going to die, and they've had a good innings. So I want you to hold that thought in your head as well. Because I wonder whether this is actually as egregious as it looks at first glance. If you lost somebody during COVID, you know, I hope I don't even need to tell you how much love and sympathy I feel for you. Of course, you know that. And clearly, some deaths could have been avoided with better political leadership. But these conversations, or at least some of these conversations, surely had to be had. And language that you wouldn't have used if you'd known that the world was going to see it at a later date, I think becomes forgivable, perhaps. I do genuinely mean this. I think I'm building up to asking you whether or not this language of Sunak and Johnson's and others enrages you, upsets you, whether or not it is outrageous. Outrageous is a good word. Is it? Because I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not sure it is. And for all of the reasons that I've just shared with you, so I kept asking you to keep those separate moments in your mind. You know, the cost of making every railway line super safe is too high, even though the alternative is deaths. The eat out to help out rationale being built essentially on the idea that even if it does spread the infection, it would still do more good than harm. I think that was a miscalculation, but we were well behind it at the time, all of us. And the fact that we were never capable of hermetically sealing the population. We could have done things differently. We could perhaps have isolated the vulnerable more effectively. But then lots of people who didn't have underlying conditions and lots of people who didn't have particular vulnerabilities also got very ill and died. So it's a responsible conversation, and in many ways I'm completely open to the idea that I've overthought this, that I'm being too kind. But is it outrageous that politicians were discussing potential deaths in quite transactional terms? Is it really outrageous? I mean, hand on heart, are you disgusted by this? Because I was at first, and then I caught on to myself and thought, am I becoming a bit too quick to be disgusted by these people? I talked about it at 10 o'clock this morning. Am I becoming too quick to be disgusted? Do I need to think more about whether this is actually disgusting behaviour? In the context of the so-called benefits crackdown, I did think more, and lo and behold, I concluded that it was indeed disgusting. But I'm not so sure about this one. I mean, even the line about an innings, if you didn't know it was going to come out, I think a lot more people would speak like that in private than we perhaps are prepared to admit when examining Sunak and Johnson doing it. Talking about old people, and I've seen pictures, very poignant and moving pictures on social media of people's parents and grandparents who did die, and the idea that Johnson and Sunak were kind of, I hope I'm not going to talk myself out of this again like I did in the first hour, Johnson and Sunak were kind of prepared to I think what I'm saying is there were bound to be some deaths, and their job was to balance out the inevitability of deaths with other issues, with economic issues, with social issues, with ensuring that we had a country to come back to when we came out of lockdown. So it's an odd question, this, and I'm putting myself in your hands in many ways on the sensitivity issue. But I just want to know whether it is as outrageous as the Daily Mirror is reporting this morning for Rishi Sunak to have essentially accepted that some people would die as a consequence of COVID policies, because there was not a single policy available to anybody that would have eradicated the risk of death. So every policy then becomes a cost-benefit analysis. You cannot do what would need to be done to make sure that nobody died. Nobody died. People were going to die. how outrageous is it that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer contemplated some deaths being a price worth paying for other benefits? Lynn describes it as pragmatism and perspective. Rachel points out that it could have been your own mum who was collateral damage and had to die all alone. And there are two texts there cutting to the very, very heart of this issue. One is very clear-headed and analytical, and one is quite rightly very emotional. I would not be able to have this conversation, Rachel, as I think you probably know, if I had lost my mum in these circumstances. But that's why victims' families don't decide sentences in court. Isn't it? You have to remove emotion from the equation. And, regardless of who we may have lost, you can't argue that there was an option open to the government that would have rendered the death toll nil. It would have been zero. So I mean, listen, it's perfectly possible, but by 1 o'clock I'd have gone a 180 on this. But I'm just wondering whether the language is as obnoxious when you think about it as it is when you first see it. That's all. And by all means, ring me and tell me, yes, James, give your head a wobble. It absolutely is as obnoxious. But whatever they did, some people would die. How many other people have got Lord Farquhar's words echoing in the back of their minds every time I dance on this pinhead? Whatever they did, some people would die. So how obnoxious is it for them to have been talking about people dying? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 21 after 12 is the time. Adrian knows what I'm talking about. He says, at first your gut says disgusting, but then you realise people are making decisions like this every day. In the NHS, for example, on how they spend the budget they're given. Do we prioritise premature babies over people with cancer? It must just be the toughest job. But then again, Joanne points out, it doesn't matter how the conversations were occurring and whether they were inevitable. There's something about the reported language that is obnoxious. She says it's the way in which these inevitable deaths were couched, James, and yes, you should give your head a wobble, i.e. let the bodies pile high, is wicked. If Johnson and Sunak had said what must be done to minimise loss of life across society, it would have been very different. I take that point as well. But remember that Sunak's comments are as reported by Dominic Cummings. He says, Rishi thinks just let people die and that's okay. I don't know if I'd want to rely upon Dominic Cummings' word if he was reporting what I'd said in a different circumstance. So Rishi Sunak might have said, look, people are going to die. Our job is to, minimise it without crippling the economy. That was something that we heard a lot. And he would probably argue that's what he tried to do. But if you did cripple the economy, there would have been fewer deaths. I just think it's interesting, more interesting than I realised at first. Ali's in Barnet. Ali, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking the call. I basically was having a discussion with your... With the sorry, I forget the name, but
producer.
I was having a producer. That's it, right? So, and what I was saying is, look, obviously people have to make these kind of difficult decisions, but where the outrage comes in is when you have a look and see what they were doing with the money, and were there any instances of where money was spent inappropriately? And the answer to that is yes, they were spending millions of pounds on these contracts to their friends of
but not consciously. Listen, that I don't want to get distracted from the central question because it's complicated enough as it is. None of these, however dodgy these contracts may have turned out to be, nobody was shoveling money into their friends' pockets knowing that they weren't going to get what they needed in return. They might have been naive and foolish, but they weren't engaged in deliberate and obvious corruption. From the doshing it out end of the transaction. I can't speak for the people on the receiving end of the transaction. So that doesn't change the nature of a conversation about the inevitability of some death. So what are you specifically, what are you outraged by?
Again, obviously, nobody would willingly know that. But in a circumstance like that, where the country is in a situation like that, where we need more...
What are you outraged by? What are you outraged by?
I'm outraged mainly by how money was spent.
But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the language of letting bodies pile high or letting people die. You're not outraged by that.
Of course I'm outraged
Why?
by that. I think that's because it's such a... you're reducing people to numbers. You're taking the
But it was true.
But
there were always going to be numbers. Death rates reduce people to numbers.
But, I think...
These are statistics.
That's
People are going
to
die.
That's true, but I think any time you're in these kind of positions, you have to be careful of not falling into that trap of just seeing people as numbers. Because
but then we're back.
Of
course it could. But that's not the point, is it? Then we're back to the observation about it being a private conversation that they weren't expecting to be made public. I just want to pin down why this is obnoxious, and absolutely open to the possibility that I'm being far too generous. It's a curse of mine. Alan picks up on it. It puts it very well, actually. If you've got a list of those people who have already had a good innings, we can get them tattooed up and on a database so that whenever things are a bit rough, we can let a few return to the pavilion, because that's what it sounds like you're supporting. I'm not really. Well, I know I'm not, but I am. I mean, is this a conversation about morality or semantics or syntax? Is it about morality or vocabulary? I'm genuinely not sure. I think that if the behaviour was as bad as I initially thought it was, then you'd want them on charges. This sort of callousness in public office. Whereas a conversation, and I don't think Whitty or Vallance are accusing the politicians of the kind of callousness that the headlines accuse them of. Whereas in these situations, I don't know how shocked I am when I really stop to think about it, that conversations included a consciousness of death being inevitable as a consequence of a policy. Jeff's in Ealing. Jeff, what do you think?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I wouldn't say so much that I was outraged. I think at this point I'm just very, very disappointed. And I think it is correct for people to kind of lean on the side of being very, very annoyed by this.
Yes.
I think when we come to analysing risk and outcome, I think that's fine and we shouldn't criticise the people doing it. But I think we should expect that the people making those analysis are competent, experienced, and are using the correct evidence base to make those decisions. Like we will have inquiries about, say, a massive incident where lots of people have been injured or at risk, and the paramedics will make a triage assessment about who to see first and so on, and that can be quite...
Exactly.
And I think what we were expecting was that the people making the decisions would have done that at the time. But I think what we're finding through the COVID inquiry is that they weren't making good decisions. They were being influenced by the press, by the media,
and you can't separate the two. You can't separate the apparent callousness and arrogance of the language from the poorness of the decision making, because we probably both think that they'd have made better decisions if callousness and arrogance weren't in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
At the time, I worked in local authority regulations, so we were quite at the front line of implementing some of these decisions. And I find a lot of these conversations quite triggering, actually, because it's a really stressful time.
I can only imagine.
While I'm on, I mean, there were things like Eat Out to Help Out could have been a good idea if they had funded instead food businesses to provide takeaway meals and funded that, so we don't have bringing loads of people in together, queuing outside restaurants, them being really full. If you wanted to support those businesses which were disadvantaged by restrictions, then encourage them and offer discounts and incentivise them to offer food or whatever their business is in such a way that doesn't, put people at more epidemiological risk than, and instead choosing to encourage people and restaurants to squeeze in as many people to take advantage of.
It was bonkers, wasn't it, at the time? You thinking back to it, you're absolutely right. And so, what about this? I think it's sounding pretty flimsy now, although I make the point in good faith. The idea that a conversation unfolding in private with no expectation of it ever being public is going to be very different. I think of, doctors or mortuary humour, for want of a better analogy. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but I think that would be very naive. And I think also the job of leaders is to take into account all the opinions and to manage the conflict. But it's very interesting at the moment that some papers are picking up on Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance being in slight disagreement about.
Yes, I think we're going to cover that
measures.
next, actually.
Yeah, but that's entirely to be expected.
As they both stress this is perfectly part of the process of arriving at decisions.
But you listen to those two talk about each other,
yes,
and they're both saying, yes, of course.
Yes.
Chris Whitty had a public health aspect to his role, so Patrick Vallance says, that was entirely expected. Chris Whitty does the same. They both appreciate each other's points of views and perspectives and acknowledge it's for the politicians to address conflict. When it's brought into the political phase, it becomes so polarised that you can't have a reasoned discussion, which is why you end up with, quotes of saying, oh, so-and-so said, they go to the extremes. Let the bodies pile high. Oh, you're a lockdown. You're pro-lockdown. I mean, I don't know anyone that's pro-lockdown that's not authoritarian dictators.
No one. No, as in the sense that it was a necessary evil, but no one relished it. No one. What about this line here? This line here from Patrick Vallance's diary. Yes, there will be more casualties, but so be it. They have had a good innings. Can you see that? Can you contextualise that and find it forgivable, or is it just disgusting?
Well, it's the language that you use. I would. I mean, it sounds awful.
No, it might do.
More human, but you might say that you would acknowledge the fact that there's a lot more protection. That generally, say, as going back to the medic example, if you had two people that need a kidney and they'll die otherwise, if one's a child and one's elderly, then you make a decision on that basis. But you need to be grown up and say these are the reasons upon which we made the decision. Yeah. At the moment, I've got a horrible feeling some of the reasons are, I don't know, lobbying or media pressure.
Keeping the newspaper owners happy. And that is more important than the apparent callousness of the language that they used. And that is, as you rightly point out, and I fully understand why that would be triggering for you. I fully I get that. And I also think that the privacy element is relevant as well. I'm pretty sure that we would have had a conversation. I've just realised something awful. In the great context of this conversation, it's quite trivial, but it's certainly given me pause. I'll tell you in a minute. We'd have talked differently off air to how we talked on air. I don't think that's a massive admission. I don't think I'd have been as callous or as arrogant as Johnson was, but we would have had a conversation off air that would have been a less guarded than the conversation we had on air. 12:36 is the time. Phil in Devon isn't happy, and I shall take this on the chin, Philip. It's disgusting how you so-called journalists try to justify your cowardice in not speaking truth to power. That's not something I'm often accused of, Phil, but I will take my medicine. Try punting this nonsense to someone who lost their mum or a little girl who lost her daddy. Well, I mean, not to make light of it, but I am. I'm talking to everybody who's listening to this, including people that would have lost beloved family members in lockdown. And I'm wondering, perhaps less so Johnson, because I think we can all imagine Johnson's level of concern for anybody other than Johnson. But I'm wondering whether Sunak's cost-benefit calculations are as obnoxious as they originally appear. And I'm thinking about his knowledge and consciousness that whatever they decided to do would cause deaths. And if you weren't talking about that, it would be weird. So how cross can we really be, reasonably, about the fact that they were talking about it? Rishi Sunak did not do a full cost-benefit analysis, says Sarah. That was the flaw. He just said, let them die, without actually checking what the price was. And Lawrence speaks for many of you when he says, your problem, James, is that you always want to see the best in people. Johnson and Sunak at the time were so grossly negligent to the point where their staffers were calling them Dr. Death. They wouldn't have done that for no reason. And that perhaps is the cause for the biggest pause so far in this conversation. But the inquiry is underway, and Helen Hodinott has been keeping an eye on proceedings for us this morning. What stands out, Helen?
Well, James, hot off the heels from Sir Patrick Vallance's testimony yesterday, we have Sir Chris Whitty giving his evidence to the inquiry. And of course, people were keen to see how Sir Chris was going to respond to Sir Patrick's suggestion yesterday that there were some tensions between the two of them, which basically boiled down to Sir Patrick backing going into lockdowns harder and faster, and Sir Chris Whitty being more cautious, wanting to hold off a bit longer, taking into account the wider public health implications of a lockdown. And in the end, Sir Chris played down the idea of a rift between him and Sir Patrick, allegations which were also outlined in a book by the sage scientist Sir Jeremy Farrar. Let's listen to how Sir Chris addressed the claims this morning.
Well, Sir Jeremy, who is a good friend and colleague, had a book to sell, and that made it more exciting, I'm told. My own view was that actually the differences were extremely small. And the main one, and Sir Patrick, I thought, put it very well, was that I saw as part of my role within SAGE, and this is my first role as an individual, to reflect some of the very significant problems for particularly areas of deprivation I saw from many of the actions that we were taking in terms of what was going to be advised to ministers to consider for what they did next. And I think that was an appropriate thing for me to do. Sir Patrick also thought it was appropriate. Inevitably, it meant that we appeared to have slightly different starting points in SAGE, but the end product was the SAGE view, and we reflected the SAGE view when we went to ministers, which was, in my view, the correct way to do it.
There's still singeing there, Jeremy Farrar. You won't get up from that burn in a hurry, I don't think. But actually, a caller just before you came in, Helen, was touching upon the fact that there was clearly some disagreement between Whitty and Vallance, but it was civilised and adult disagreement that leads towards a sort of synthesis or a compromise, which then becomes the official position.
Absolutely. And this is what he was saying today, was that it was a useful disagreement that they had between the two of them. And he was very, very much not playing up to the idea, perhaps unsurprisingly, of any kind of scandal today. So next, the counsel to the inquiry, Hugo Keith, KC, repeatedly asked Sir Chris about reports that he warned the government against overreacting in the early days of the pandemic. And in response, Chris Whitty very firmly said, "I've rejected and I will continue to reject your characterisation of overreacting." He said the position of himself and SAGE was for action, saying that if you wish to avoid a loss of life, you need to act. But he has this morning admitted that he now thinks, with the benefit of hindsight, that the UK was late to go into the first lockdown. But he insists that he didn't deny that it would need to happen at some point.
I was confident we were going to have to do them, to be clear, but when we started, the disadvantages of all the actions, not just full lockdown, but other actions before that, for example, what was initially called cocooning and then shielding, as an example, stopping schooling is another, the biggest impacts of those would be in areas of deprivation and those in difficulties and those living alone and so on. So I was very aware that we essentially had two different things we were trying to balance. The risk of going too early, in which case you get all the damages from this with actually fairly minimal impact on the epidemic, and the risk of going too late, in which case you get all the problems of the pandemic running away. Now, as we will, I'm sure, come on to, my view is, with the benefit of hindsight, we went a bit too late on the first wave, and I've been very clear about that for some time.
Very measured. And not as damning, really, yet as Patrick Vallance, because it was Patrick Vallance's diaries, really, more than what he actually said in person that possibly conveyed the most troubling testimony. The spectre of Dominic Cummings has appeared, I believe, today.
It has, yes. There's been quite a lot of talk about SAGE and how information would get from these SAGE meetings to ministers. Professor Sir Chris Whitty said that firstly, there were usually just a couple of hours between a meeting of the scientists and the COBRA meetings which would receive that advice. And then secondly, he said that it was often up to him and Sir Patrick Vallance to verbally relay the scientists' deliberations to ministers because of the fast-moving nature of the pandemic. And he has given his view on something that did cause a bit of a furore at the time, having former Number 10 aide Dominic Cummings at SAGE meetings. He said he thought it was perfectly reasonable for him and others to attend, and he didn't see Number 10 representatives attempting to bias the outcomes.
That is interesting. It ties into the conversation that we're having at the moment, because at first glance, and I think I was probably guilty of this, you think Cummings is probably there to put the frighteners on people, or he is sitting there, like Dr. Evil, stroking his chin and trying to get the scientists to offer up the advice that he wants for political reasons. But Chris Whitty turns around and says, actually, it was perfectly reasonable in the circumstances, and who are we to argue?
Yes, and actually what people are saying is that, especially with Chris Whitty and with Sir Patrick Vallance, they don't necessarily now have an axe to grind. So they are coming into this in a very, very measured way. You were speaking about the dramatic revelations made yesterday, and a lot of those, as you say, were because of those diaries, which Sir Patrick actually said they were never intended to be read by anyone. They were almost a coping mechanism that he was using for himself just to get through day to day. So, yes, the hearing so far is much more measured and will probably continue to be that way for the rest of today. So Chris might be questioned into tomorrow as well.
Helen Hoddinott, many thanks indeed. I think it was the Vallance diaries that probably made me start thinking about the privacy angle of the conversations that Johnson and Sunak were having at the time. The knowledge or the belief that it would never be made public would make you write things and indeed say things that you wouldn't say or write if you knew that they were going to be made public. But it's fair to say that most of you disagree with me on this one. Alan Sunderland puts it very pithily: you have lost your mind. They actively created policies that guaranteed thousands of deaths. Well, there is no point having a mind, Al, if you never change it. 12:48 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Chit sums things up quite nicely. Thank you for the kind words about the show. He writes, I think the principle of our leaders needing to make choices on who lives and who dies is not in question and is clearly a reality. But I think you're attempting to separate the language from the dilemma, which takes away some context. For me, it comes down to a lack of integrity that our leaders would speak in this way at a time of national crisis. And that's before you take into account the multiple other examples that this government has seemingly shown a trend of, a lack of moral standards and that integrity. And then Paul in Belfast pretty much explodes my question about whether the fact that these were not conversations that anyone expected to be made public offers up a degree of defence. He writes very powerfully, James, it would have been my mum and dad's 63rd wedding anniversary today, but dad died of COVID in 2022. But sure, he had a good innings. I cannot believe, after all the despicable things this government have done and said, that you're excusing these words as private or not expecting the public to see. That logic would excuse the, quotes, locker room talk that you've criticised rightly in the past. Johnson and Sunak meant people like my dad were expendable, but they didn't mean their parents or anyone elderly whom they loved. We mourn him every day while they continue to pretend that they care. I think you've done me there, Paul, actually. I don't know that I've got a single line of defence left for the position I was exploring at the top of this hour. So thank you. Jenny's in Woolwich. Jenny, what would you like to say?
Oh, my heart just goes out to Paul there in Belfast. That was really, really moving. I really feel for him. And as for you, young man, you could, at the beginning of this, I picked up the phone in absolute fury. And I almost wanted to accuse you of having that public boy arrogant swagger.
Well, I do have it, but I don't think it was to blame for today's sort of misstep. It wasn't really a misstep. It was a genuine inquiry that turned out to be pretty wrong.
It was. I almost have run out of things to say after all those very
Stop calling me names. Just call me names a bit more if you've run out of things to say.
No, after all those really eloquent things your listeners have sent in. But they did look at all the language. We turned around and said they're in positions of power. WhatsApp is not a private conversation. It is a communication tool.
Yes.
And all this open, nobody can read it, nobody can access it. That's just between you, but it is still accessible. And people in those positions should know it is. I have been in senior management in companies and we have had crisis. If I had people running around going, oh, Domo, Gobi, references to the Prime Minister, references to the Chief Executive, having an onanistic moment over the Jaws movie Mayor.
Yes.
It's disgusting.
And you can't, this is the point Chip made, you can't separate the two. So the missteps and the errors and the profound misjudgments are inextricably linked to the atmosphere in which they were made, and the language deployed by all of these people is an intrinsic part of the atmosphere in which the decisions were made. Well, hang on, just one thing that occurs to me, and drawing on your experience, it would be unreasonable to expect them all to have been walking around with 10-ton weights on their shoulders for the entire duration of this period. So that there was going to be some language that would look out of place if it were. Do you see what I mean? If we were eavesdropping, we'd be surprised at the lack of gravity in the room, but that doesn't mean that we can excuse all instances or even explain all instances of lack of gravitas even.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that I might not have gone onto a quiet corner or found a close colleague and maybe had a little swear up. But like there's in the Valence diaries, he has a bit the cabinet are all upbeat and smiling, talking about getting in the Treasury as the death squad. It's beyond atrocious. And
I think I think you're right to bring the public school thing into it. Actually, I saw Cameron yesterday at the 22 committee saying it was like going back to school, and my heart sank because for him everything is like going back to school. I don't think he'd have been as bad as Johnson in the COVID thing, but that whole stiff upper lip, it's only pain, it doesn't really hurt. Masking emotional vulnerability by pretending that you don't have any. I don't think Johnson pretends. I think he lacks empathy in the clearest sense, and I wanted to believe that Sunak was a bit different. That's all.
No, he's just an inferior public boy because he didn't get to go to Eton. Because with your experience, there is an awful lot of that.
Yes.
There's a hierarchy. There's a public school boy hierarchy.
Well, you know what Gilly Cooper said about that, Jenny?
What did she say? No, I can't remember.
She said, I think Sunak went to Winchester. She said, boys who went to Harrow looked down on boys who went to Winchester. And boys who went to Eton looked down on boys who went to Harrow. And boys who went to Ampleforth looked down on everybody.
Absolutely.
Guess where I went?
Were you Ampleforth or where?
It was indeed, yes. I was indeed. But I don't think that's true. And I spent my life guarding against the temptations of. Well, in fact, anyone who's followed things closely will know. I kind of worked very hard to shrug off that fake confidence that comes from denying pain that you were caused as a child. That's where a lot of it comes from. That's where I can muster up some sympathy for these people that Jenny cannot, because it is things that were done to us as children at these schools that force us to grow these thick skins and these armours and to live our lives with our fists up, always swinging or waiting for the next attack. So I do get it a little bit, but it doesn't in any way excuse the conduct. And I think Jenny's done me almost on the therapist's couch there. Probably me attempting to muster up some form of defence of this conduct is born of a lingering sympathy for that kind of attitude, that kind of stiff upper lip attitude. Angie picks up on a point a few of you have made with reference also to Leo Varadkar, but she chooses Jacinda Ardern and says, I simply can't imagine Jacinda Ardern using these phrases. They've had a good innings, or the much worse ones reported either in private or in public, James. And Teresa is in Bournemouth. Teresa, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'd like to say, first of all, I'm really sorry if they had bad childhoods. A lot of people have bad childhoods.
Yes.
What I did want to say is that you said, you've got to see this in the context of COVID. I think you've got to see it in a much broader context.
Of humanity.
In 2010, these people came in and decided that vulnerable people were scroungers.
Yes.
They were people who had no value in this country because they had no value to the economy.
Yeah.
They demonised us. You know what I mean? The disability benefits were cut.
So you see it. I don't know if you were listening to the first hour, but you've just knitted this conversation into the first conversation we had today quite perfectly.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You need to see a much broader context.
Yeah, you're right.
If somebody tells you who you are, believe them. Do you know what I mean? If
I do know what you mean. I Maya Angelou, I think, who said that, who we could all turn to in times of need. And my friend Dorothy's been in touch, actually, a former colleague of mine, to express her shock at the early stages of this phone-in. She adds, just like you, Teresa, we had 10 years of austerity before the pandemic. Of course they were callous and didn't care. Why would they suddenly have discovered a heart and some morals in the moment?
Absolutely. And that's not to take away from any distrust of the public school system that they grew up in.
No, it feels a bit silly offering that up, but it is actually quite a helpful account when Cameron said don't worry about Boris when he got COVID. I've seen him play tennis. He'll be fine. That, to me, spoke volumes of the kind of madness that's inflicted on us at those schools. But I'm not suggesting for a minute that it excuses callousness and arrogance in the context of COVID management. However, it perhaps explains it. So I think my big mistake at 12 o'clock today was to conflate explain with excuse, which is something I always give you a right old ticking off for. So physician, heal thyself turns back on me today. Alan in Chesterfield. We'll have to be quick, Alan, but what would you like to say?
James, everything I wanted to say has been very, very well summed up by the last couple of callers, and particularly the last two texters. Everything these guys said is the language. Some of you were going to die. Never some of us.
That was actually
Never
Lord
some of
Farquhar in Shrek. I don't know if they actually said that out loud, yes.
But it's some of them.
Yeah, I know.
Let our bodies pile high.
Yeah, you're right, aren't you?
Yeah, it's them. It's us and them. And all the policies that they failed on, whether it be protective clothing, eat out to help out, they were aimed at the masses.
You had to have.
You wouldn't see Boris in the local shippy getting 2 for 1.
Well, to be fair to Sunak, he did turn up at Wagamama and pretend to be a waiter for 10 minutes. But you're right, there's an intrinsic sense of social hierarchy, human hierarchy, in the. People that I can normally spot from a million miles away, so I'm not quite sure what went wrong today. I give the last word, Alan, with your permission, to Sophie, who writes, I could forgive their language if there were any evidence that they cared for the vulnerable. There are over 500,000 clinically extremely vulnerable people in the UK who don't respond to the vaccine. Antiviral treatment exists for them, but the government refuses to provide it. So it continues. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows there to catch up on, as well as the best video clips from LBC and other global stations. So do pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now on LBC, it's Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you very much, James. 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 Thank you very